Welcome to Dr. Gary on Tehillat. Today I'm going to discuss King David's riddle, Psalm 145's hidden meaning. This lecture is in memory of Adin Zehavi and should be zechus for the refuah shlema for her son Michael. Adina bas Sheva bas Dov ber Azriel Halevi fought like a lion to save her family from their burning house. Together with her husband Aryeh, they were able to rescue their children. Unfortunately, Michael ben Adina bat Sheva had burns on his body and requires our tefillos and our tehillim to have a zechus that he should get a speedy recovery. So Tehillat 145 has some really special rewards connected to it. The Gemara in Brachot says, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Amar Rabbi Avina, Rabbi Elazar said in the names of Rabbi Avina, Kol ha'omer Tehillat David b'chol yom shalosh pamim. Anybody that says Tehillat David every day, and there are some girsas that don't include the words 3 times, but nonetheless on a daily basis, Muftach lo, it is promised to him shehu ben olam haba, that he has a place guaranteed in the world to come. And the Gemara really struggles with why is it that this is such an important psalm. So my timer. If you're going to tell me that Tehillat David, Psalm 145, is so special because it has an alphabetic acrostic structure, Nema Ashrei Tmimei Derech, I'm going to say that you should say instead Psalm 119, the Isbe Timna Apin, that it has each verse 8 times, and so that seems like a greater alphabetical acrostic structure. Ela mishum di isbe poteach chasyadecha. Rather, it's because it has the verse of God has His hand open, umasbila chocharazon, and sustains all life. So the Gemara says, if you're going to say that that's the reason that the Tehillim of Tehillat David, Psalm 145, is so special, Nema Halal Hagadol. We should say instead Tehillim 136, which is called Halal Hagadol, the Kasibeh that has in it No Sein Lechem L'chol Basar Kili Olam Chasto, which is even a more explicit and great description of God being a sustainer of all beings. So the Gemara says, okay, so it's not because of the alphabetical acrostic structure, and it's not because of Poteach Chasyadecha. Rather, it's because Mishum Isbe Tarti, because it has both structure and it has meaning. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, so Rabbi Yochanan says, Mipnei malo nemar nun ba'ashrei. Why is ashrei missing the letter nun? So in ashrei, you should know that it skips the letter nun verse. Mipnei, so Gemara says, why is it not there? Mipnei sheyesh ba mafalasan shel sona Yisrael. Because the nun verse would have in it about the downfall of the haters of Israel, and really the Gemara doesn't want to talk about the Jewish nation in a negative way. This is really a way of saying that it has a discussion of the downfall of Bnei Israel. So the Gemara says, what is the pasuk that would be there? The kasif nafla. There is a downfall. Lo tosif kum. It will no longer get up betulas Yisrael. Bnei Israel will have a sustained downfall. And that comes from Amos, who lived 200 years after David Melech. But in the west, which is in Israel, B'ma'arava metartzei lei hachi. In the west, they explained it this way: Nafla, there's a downfall. Below tosiflin full ode, but there will no longer be a downfall afterwards. Kum betulas Yisrael, get up, the virgins of Israel. Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, Afilu hachi, even though David Melech skipped over the verse that begins with Nun about the downfall, Chazar David went back, v'samchan beruach hakodesh, and mentioned through ruach hakodesh, he made a hint, shenemar somech Hashem l'chol hanoflim, that after the Nun verse is the verse beginning with samech, and that verse says somech Hashem l'chol hanoflim, that Hashem supports all the fallen. While that's really amazing that there's this Hashem supporting the fallen, but it really doesn't explain why Chazal felt that someone who says Ashrei 3 times a day is worthy of getting the world to come. So what is it that makes Psalm 145 so special? So you have to understand the structure of the Tehillim. And the structure really helps us understand that the Ashrei is really about man's relationship with God. There's a sense of Hashem's transcendence versus His immanence, which means His kingship and what we call Malkenu, versus his goodness, his Tuv and Avinu, his relationship, close relationship to us. The fact that there's closeness of how we describe him. Sometimes we describe God in the third person, and sometimes it describes God in the second person. Second person has a sense of closeness, as opposed to third person, which has a sense of distance, somewhat unknowable. And what's fascinating is that even within the sections of Tehillah LeDavid, which include Hashem's transcendence, they'll be intermixing second and third person. Same thing within his Tuv. Sometimes within his Tuv, his immanence, it will describe God in the second person and sometimes in the third person. And finally, there's a progression within the Tehillah LeDavid of bracha, of being close to God. The David HaMelech starts in verses 1 and 2. He says, B'chol yom avarchaka, every single day I will bless. He progresses in verse Yud to the Chasidecha Yivarchucha. Now he's expanded to the Chasidim, bless God. And in verse 21, in Tehillat Hashem Yidaber Pi, he says, Vivarech kol basar, all flesh, now are expanded to blessing God. And here is the outline, which was first published by Rabbi Meir Weiss in Tehillah LeDavid, titled Tehillah LeDavid in 1958. And here he really cleverly figured out that there is an envelope structure, that the Tehillim begins with Tehillah LeDavid and ends with Tehillat Hashem Yidaber Pi. Okay? And then the concept of bracha. That in the first two verses we have Avarechacha Shimcha Liolam Va'ed. This is followed in Psukim Gimel through Vav with Hashem's Malchus, his transcendence. And you'll notice that Pasuk Gimel has Gadol in it, and Pasuk Vav has Gadol, which forms another envelope structure for this section. And the concept of Gadol is a concept of an exponential a multiplying of greatness. And there's a cute way to remember that Gadol is like a multiplicity of good. The letter Gimel has a gematria of 3, the letter Dalet has a gematria of 4, and Lamed is the 12th letter of the Aleph base, so 3 times 4 equals 12. What's also interesting is that there's going to be a repetition of words to the second half, to connect the section of Hashem's Malchus, his transcendence, in the second half to another section of Hashem's transcendence, his Malchus. So we're going to see the words Gevura, Dor Lador, and Hadar Kavod in the second half. Now moving to verses Zayin through Tet is all about Hashem's Tuv, and here again we have an envelope structure, begins with Tov and ends with Tov. And in the middle we have Hashem's Yud Gimel Midos of Rachamim, Chanun Vracham Hashem, Erech Apayim Ugdal Chesed. And here we have our second half. There's the interlude, which is that Yoducha Pasuk, which has the Chasidach Yivarchucha. We return to Hashem's Malchus in Psukim Yud Aleph through Yud Gimel, 11 through 13, which has the word Malchus in each of those verses, and you're going to see that we see Gevura, we see Hadar, Kavod Hodecha, Dor Vador, which is reminiscent of the Malchus that we saw in the first half, and then Psukim Yud Daled through Chaf are all about Hashem's Tuv and Hashem taking care of his creations. And then we have the end of the in the concluding line, again we have Tehillah, we have Yivarech, Shem Leolam Va'ed. So, there's a hidden aspect of Tehillah LeDavid. And now that we understand the structure, we're now going to take apart certain structural aberrants that David HaMelech left in Tehillat LeDavid, and we're going to see if these breaks in his structure, if there's a underlying theme that connects all of his breaks. Is he trying to bring out something else? So I've identified 7 clues. So here are the 7 structural anomalies of Psalm 145. The first is, as noted in the Gemara, is the missing Nun verse. The second structural anomaly we encounter in the Psukim of 8 and 18. So every other verse in Tehillah LeDavid has a vav as a conjunction to connect the first and second clause of each verse. But in the words in the verse of Chanun Vracham Hashem, after the asnachta, which is a trup, a cantillation mark that acts as a comma, there is no vav that follows it. So this pasuk reads Chanun Racham Hashem Erech Apayim, not Ve'erech Apayim. Similarly, the only other pasuk that's missing the vav after the asnachta is Karov Hashem L'chol Karoav L'chol Asher Yikru V'emes. Instead of Karov Hashem L'chol Karoav V'L'chol Asher Yikru V'emes. These two pasukim, though, have two or three other anomalies. So the pasuk of Chanun Racham Hashem Erech Apayim has the words Gedal Chesed, and this pasuk is clearly reminiscent of the Hashem's Yud Gimel Midos of Rachamim. And if you're going to look in the Torah, that when it talks about Hashem's Yud Gimel Midos, it really says Rav Chesed. So why did David HaMelech switch out the words Rav Chesed with Gedal Chesed? And the pasuk of Karov Hashem L'chol Karoav L'chol Asher Yikru V'emes has two structural issues. One is, this pasuk could very easily have said Karov Hashem L'chol Karoav Be'emes. So why does it have to have L'chol Asher Yikru'uhu repeated? The second is, why is it Ve'emes and not Be'emes? In other words, it's why did the David HaMelech use the letter Vez and put a segel underneath instead of a letter Bez with a shva? Another interesting phenomenon that David HaMelech gives us is an seemingly unedited verse. Here's the verse I'm talking about. So the verse 15, seems to have two extra words. What is the word ata doing there, and what's the word lahem doing there? If we look at verse 14, we don't say Somech Hashem l'chol hanoflim va'ata zokef l'kol ha'chvufim. Okay, so the word ata is redundant. And secondly, in the pasuk 15 of Einei chol achisbeiru, we have the word achlam, which means ochel shalahem or ochel lahem. So, if we already have a suffix that includes the concept of lahem, why does David leave the word lahem in there? Really, the pasuk, as I've written in blue, could simply say Einei chol achisbeiru v'nosein es achlam bi'ito. Finally, there's a missing kol in Ashrei. After the tough, the Ashrei starts with B'chol Yom Avarchecha, and that is really the only kol that is used by David HaMelech just as a means of describing something he does every day. Any other mention of the word kol is now going to be explaining an aspect of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, and that's not going to happen until after Chanun Racham Hashem Erech Apayim Gedal Chesed, the verse that follows those Yud Gimel Midos of Hashem, Tov Hashem Lakol V'Rachamam Makom Asav. Those are the three kols that are found in the first half. In the second half, we have a preponderance of kols. All of a sudden, there are kols all over the place. And Yoducha Kol Masecha, then verse 13 has kol twice. There's a bunch of verses with kol twice, and a couple of verses with kol once. But clearly, verses 11 and 12 don't have the word kol in it, and verse 19 does not have the word kol in it as well. Why did David HaMelech leave them out of these psukim? So, it's possible to use an explanation of the Rokeach that will help potentially find some extra kols. So the Rokeach explains that David HaMelech chose verses 11, 12, and 13 to discuss Hashem's Malchus. And he chose them because they are a Roshei Tevos, an acronym for the word Melech. Now, we know that verses 11 and 12 don't have a kol in them, but using the Rokeach's understanding of Roshei Tevos for the pasuk, it's possible to say that there is a word kol there, since they have the first letter of those two verses spell the word kol. And so, in fact, the word kol is there. But we still don't have an explanation of why David HaMelech left the word kol out of Ritzon Yerav Yaseh, Veshavasam Yishma V'Yoshiem. He could have simply said, Ritzon Kol Yerav Yaseh, Ves Kol Shavasam Yishma V'Yoshiem. Why did he leave it out? And here's like what I spoke about, that the word kol is really not found in the first half, and is really introduced after the pasuk of Chanun Racham Hashem Erech Apayim Gedal Chesed in verse 8, and we see in verse 9 of the end of Hashem's Tuv talks about Lakol. Okay. So clue number one, I said, is the missing nun verse. And, the verse begins, the beginning with the letter nun is omitted from the alphabetical acrostic structure. And that would have been verse 13. And so in order to start to build the case for what's going on, it's important to understand that the verse prior is Malchuscha Malchus Kol Olamim, Memshaltecha B'chol Dor V'Dor. That we're talking about Hashem's kingship, and it's a beautiful verse that has all sorts of parallelisms and a chiastic structure. And then immediately we have the verse that's missing that acknowledges the fallenness to Am Yisrael, followed by Hashem supporting the fallen. Our Mesorah is that there is no nun verse. Interestingly, in the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint, they have a verse that begins with nun that was added in. And here's the verse, Ne'eman Hashem b'chol devarav v'chasid b'chol ma'asav, which clearly has a redundancy from the second half of the verse from the pasuk Tzadik Hashem b'chol deracha v'chasid b'chol ma'asav, which is one of the reasons why people do not believe this was part of the original Tehillim with this nun verse. So, clue number two, we said, is the conjunction, vav, that's missing after the asnachta in verses 8 and 18. So here's examples of it present in verses 1, 2, and 3. And here's the missing ones. So why did David Melech leave them out? So, you have to understand that verse 8 clearly is a reference to the 13 midos of God, and what comes after chesed is emes. So look at the end of pasuk 18, Karov Hashem l'chol korav l'chol asher yikruhu ve'emet. And like I stated earlier, that the repetition of Karov Hashem l'chol korav l'chol asher yikruhu ve'emes really highlights the word emes. So, what comes after the word emes? Why did David Melech go through such lengths to continue Hashem's Yid Gimel Midos in a second pasuk, but not continue with Noser Chesed, La Lafim, and Nosei Abam Bafesh V'Chatav and Akei? Why does he stop in the middle? For that, we really have to go back to where the Yid Gimel Midos are initially stated. They come out by Chet HaEgel, the first downfall of Am Yisrael. And Hashem wants to destroy the nation. And Moshe Rabbeinu comes and uses the Yid Gimel Midos to help Bnei Israel attain atonement. And perhaps this is the nefila that David Melech did not want to mention when that the Gemara is alluding to. And so David Melech leaves hints and does not explicitly make the connection to the sin of the golden calf, but instead just highlights the downfall in a very hidden way. And this is similar to what we see in other places, to speak of Lashon Sagi Nahor, to speak in an opposite manner so not to shame somebody. So here is the Yid Gimel Midos in the Torah, and what jumps out at us is that there's a structural anomaly within the Yid Gimel Midos. That's written the way it's written in the Torah is that the nun of Notzer Chesed is enlarged. It's as if David HaMelech is taking advantage of a structural anomaly within the Sefer Torah itself. And here's a second hint that we find. Here, when by Chet HaEgel, Moshe says to Hashem, Ana Chet HaAm Hazeh Chata Gedola. This nation, the sin of this nation is a great sin. Vayasu lahem Elokei Zehav, and they have made a golden god for themselves. Right? It was a form of Avodah Zarah. And so Moshe Rabbeinu says, Va'ata, and now, im tisa chatasam, if you're going to pass over their chet, great. Vim ayin, but if not, mecheni na misfaracha asher katavta, please erase me from the book that you've written. And if we just switch around the punctuation of the verse, it winds up reading like this. Va'ata, and now, im tisa chatasam, if you're going to forgive them and pass over their chet, great. Vim ayin, but if not, mechei nun misfaracha asher katavta. Erase the nun that you've written in your book. And this is really, something that David HaMelech faced. He was really struggling with his own chet and the own repercussions of his chet. And he's saying, as if he's saying to God, if you're going to forgive me, great. And if not, I'm going to erase the nun from my book. that there's a hint. And so what was King David's statement? Is that he had a relationship with Bathsheba, and Natan HaNavi gives him a parable about a shepherd who takes another shepherd's sheep, from the poor shepherd, and King David says, well, that guy deserves to be punished, and Natan says, well, you're the person that I'm talking about. And King David immediately says, Chatati LaHashem. Shows tremendous amount of being humble, anivus. And then King David is informed by Natan that there's still going to be a judgment, that there's going to be tumult in his household, and there's going to be death to the son that will be born to him and Bathsheba. David HaMelech engages in tremendous amount of teshuva. He fasts, he cries, he prays, and still his son that's born to him and Bathsheba dies. Now, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah also acknowledges that there's an internal relationship between David HaMelech's chait and the chait of the Egel HaZahav. The Gemara says, essentially, that the reason that Bnei Israel fell to the chait Egel was in order to give a paradigm for anybody that wants to do teshuvah in the future, that they should see that, they should not feel despondent that they're hopeless, because they can always look to Bnei Israel's teshuvah at Chet Egel, the sin of the golden calf, for inspiration. Similarly, the Gemara says, David was not roi la'osot ma'aseh, that it was not worthy for him to do that behavior, but that but in order to set a paradigm for the individual to know that they can always do teshuvah, David HaMelech, we look to him and what he did as when he did teshuvah. So the Gemara sees that these two, the chait of David HaMelech and the chait of Egel, are connected, and they're both paradigms of doing teshuvah. The downfall of a nation. The sin of the golden calf follows the establishment of God's kingship at Har Sinai when he gave the Torah to Bnei Israel, a culmination of creation. And it was at this point that what follows is that Bnei Israel have this immediate fall from grace. And then there's a somech, l'chol hanoflim. Then Hashem re-uplifts Bnei Israel, and they're able to figure out how to fix the relationship with Hashem. This is actually similar to the structure of Tehillat David, that Malchuscha, Malchus Kol Olamim, Hashem's kingship, is pronounced, and then we have the nefila of the missing nun, followed by the uplifting of Soymech. And so, in reality, at its heart, Tehillat David is about getting up after falling in the relationship with Hashem, how to do teshuvah and not to give up hope. So why did David HaMelech choose Gedal Chesed instead of Rab Chesed in the pasuk of Chanun Baracham Hashem? Is because Gedal Chesed comes from a different chait that Bnei Israel did in the Torah, the chait of the Meraglim, and there it says Gid Godel Chastecha, and so that is the only other time in the Torah that there is a repetition of the Yid Gimel Midos, and so that's the second nefila of Am Yisrael that David HaMelech does not want to outright mention, but wants to connect Bnei Israel to, that to know that they can do teshuvah. And so why is it ve'emet? Ve'emet is actually a sound. It's a repetition of the sound of the ve'emet of the Yud Gimel Midos. Chanun Baruch Hashem Erech Apayim Rav Chesed ve'emet, and so you have ve'emet in Karov Hashem L'chol Karoav, and again you have the redundant verse of Karov Hashem L'chol Karoav in order to really highlight the word ve'emet, and then everything, the tshuva really has to be done earnestly and in truth. Now here's an amazing thing that David HaMelech did when he left the words Ata and Lahem in the pasuk of Einei Chalech Yisaberu V'Ata Nosen Lahem Et Achlam B'Itao. Now, when I was looking at this, I thought to myself, the word achlam that I'm going to feed them, it reminds me of the word achlem, which means and I'm going to destroy them. And I went back to the Chumash to look for that pasuk, and I was astonished by what I found. So here's The Tehillim pasuk in Tehillat LaDavid, Einei cholel achisaberu va'ata nosein lahem et achlam bi'ito. Look at David's literary genius. So in Shemos it says, Ra'iti et hamazeh. Hashem says, I see this nation. David HaMelech switches is, the nation looks to you. V'hinei am k'shei orefu. They are stubborn. David HaMelech turns the stubbornness to Yishaberu, as someone who's anticipating strongly receiving their food, their sustenance. He takes the word ata with an ayin, which means now, and switches it to ata with an aleph, a homophone, a word that sounds the same but means different things. Hanichali, he tells Moshe Rabbeinu, leave me. Hanicha means to place. David switches it where Hashem gives, no saying. Hashem says to Moshe, leave me, veichara api vahem, and my anger is going to burn in them. Now, David HaMelech is really highlighting the power of teshuvah, and the power of teshuvah is the ability to erase God's anger. So David HaMelech does not make any sort of reference to God's anger, but he still retains the words bahem, lahem. And then we have vachalem, and I will destroy. Look how amazing. David HaMelech takes the same exact letters and transfers it into achlam, and I'm going to feed them. Then he says bi'ito, and bi'ito is actually a reference to the middle of the pasuk of ata. Finally, there's a part of the pasuk David HaMelech does not use, va'aseh oscha l'goy gadol, that Hashem says, Moshe Rabbeinu, I'm going to destroy the nation, I'm going to start over from you. And David HaMelech was aware of the ability of God to start over the kingship with somebody else. And he does not want to make an allusion to starting over the kingship with somebody else, because with a different family, because that was something that concerned him. Because he knew what happened with Shaul, that Shaul did not kill off all the booty, the animals from Amalek and Agag. And Shmuel says he's going to eventually lose his kingship and is transferred over to David. David is worried that his chait is going to cause his kingship to be lost. And so he does not use the words va'aseh oscha l'goy gadol. How amazing is David HaMelech that he's taking the verse in the Torah that has Hashem's strongest midas hadin, ra'it yam hazevin am k'shei orevat hu va'ata hanichali v'yicharapi b'hem b'chalem. And through the power of tshuva, he flips it 180 degrees and creates midas harachmim. Amazing. Finally, we have the missing kol, right? It does not have the word kol. Now, kol, interestingly, has a gematria of 50. And what did we say? The letter that's missing from Tehillat LaDavid is nun, which also means 50. So 50 has a sense of completeness. And David HaMelech, though, he asked Hashem for something when he did, after he was doing teshuvah. Hashem did not grant David's will for anything, right? Bathsheba and his son dies. And so the concept of saying Ritzon Kol Rayav Ya'aseh, Ves Kol Shavasam Yishma V'Yoshem, to say that God does the Ritzon, the will of everybody, would be disingenuous. It would just not be true. And so therefore, the kol is omitted from this pasuk because of that. Even when your teshuvah is accepted, it does not mean that we escape punishment. So David HaMelech has this word kol, and it has a completeness, because once you do teshuvah, you're able to fix a problem in the relationship with Hashem and make it complete again. And the complexity of Tehillat LaDavid is what makes it a superior choice over any other Tehillim. And the completeness of the Tehillim is truly amazing. And I'm going to digress for a moment to talk about actually Tehillat LaDavid's place in the overall structure of all of Sefer Tehillim. So there's an interesting Gemara in Brachot which talks about the fact that Perek Aleph of Tehillim and Perek Beis of Tehillim at one point were thought to be a united Perek of Tehillim, Chad Parshahi. The Amar Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachmani, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Kol Parshas, Haisa, Chaviva, Al David, Pasach Ba'ashrei, V'siyim Ba'ashrei. So Shmuel Bar Nachmani says in Rabbi Yochanan, name of Rabbi Yochanan, any parsha that was beloved to David started with Ashrei and ended with Ashrei. And so, how does it start with Ashrei? Patabach Ashrei to Kasiv Ashrei Aish, which is the first pasuk of all of Tehillim. V'siyim by Ashrei to Kasiv Ashrei Kol Chosebo, which is the last pasuk of the second parak of Tehillim. Tosos asks, what do you mean? Kol Parshas Chaviva Al David. V'im Tomar, if you're going to say my Kol Parshios, what does it mean? All the Parshios. Bahalo Ashkachan Shum Parsha Acheres. Is it not true that there's no other parak shemitchilasan ba'ashrei misayamis ba'ashrei? That these are the opening parak, the opening two parakim are the only two parakim that begin and end with ashrei if we combine them. So the Tosa says you're not understanding. V'yesh lomar, it's possible to say the lav dafka poteches ba'ashrei v'siyim ba'ashrei. It's not specific that we're talking about those words. We're talking about that style, the envelope structure. Ela chasima me'ein pesicha is really when the beginning and end have a mirror element to it. What does he mean? Kimo tehila shepatach betehila l'David v'siyim betehila Hashem yidaber pi. Look how amazing. Tosfos is very cognizant of the importance of structure. V'chein harbe parshios shemitchilos behalaluka mesayamos behalaluka. And similarly, many other parshios begin and end with halaluka, which interestingly is every parsha from after Tehillah David of 146 through 150, which is the end of Sefer Tehillim, in fact begins and ends with halaluka. So it winds up being that we can see that the words Ashrei perhaps can be expanded otherwise. What do I mean? So David HaMelech starts with the word Ashrei because it is a quote from the last line that Moshe Rabbeinu says to Bnei Israel. In the end of Devarim he says, Ashrecha Yisrael mi kamocha am nosha b'Hashem magen ezrecha v'asher cherev kavasecha v'ichashu oivecha lacha v'ata al bomosenu tirdoch. So David Melech paraphrases part of the of Moshe Rabbeinu's last line. He says, Ashrei ish asher lo halach b'asas rishayim v'derech chatayim lo amad v'moshe bleitzim lo yashav. And interestingly, perhaps we could say that the end of Tehillim comes to a conclusion actually with Psalm 144. Ashrei ha'am shekachalo, Ashrei ha'am she'Hashem elokav. Praiseworthy is the nation that is like this. Praiseworthy is the nation that has Hashem as their God. And both of these psukim really reference Moshe Rabbeinu's last line in the Torah. And perhaps that's what the Chazal meant, that any parak that begins and it ends with Ashrei is chaviv to David HaMelech, that the entire Sefer Tehillim is in fact beloved to David HaMelech. So here's how the first line mirrors Moshe Rabbeinu's line, is that Moshe Rabbeinu says Oivecha, and so David HaMelech explains Oivecha is Rishayim, Chatayim, and Leitzim, evil people, sinners, and scoffers. And instead of using the word tirdoch, he uses the word derech. Similarly, when he says Ashrei Yam Shekachalo, Ashrei Hashem Elokav, it's echoing the words of Moshe Rabbeinu, Mi Ka'amocha Am Nosha B'Hashem. And so we have a sense now of what the Tosos is saying potentially could be extended to say that Tehillim can be separated with a certain idea that there's the 5 books of Tehillim, and the Midrash Tehillim says that Moshe Rabbeinu gave us 5 books of the Torah, and David HaMelech gave us 5 books of Tehillim. It's not to say that every one of the parakim is written by David, as the Gemara says that there's at least 10 different authors of Tehillim, but that David HaMelech had a hand in the extent of having all these multiple books. So we have that 145 then, Tehillim 145, is really the beginning of its own unit. That's book 5 really ends with Tehillim 144 of Ashrei Am Shekachalo, Ashrei Am Shem Elokav. Then you have Tehillah LaDavid, which is the Mizmor for which all of Tehillim gets its name. Tehillah LaDavid really is a conclusion to all of Tehillim. And then you have an epilogue, and an orchestral celebration of praising God that is in 146 through 150. And so, really, we wind up having is that the Tehillim is, this parak of Tehillim 145 is all about how to live in close proximity to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's amazing, and there's an awesomeness to it, and also there's important to really know how to fix the relationship with God when you are so close to Him. And so David HaMelech is really outlining that we can have Hashem's immanence and transcendence, His being in second and third person, and achieving a closeness, and embedded, underlying all that is the Yid Gimel Midos, and the ability to switch Hashem's Midas Hadin of that in the Torah to Midas Harachmim of Einecholech Yisperu V'atanoten Lehem Et Achlam B'ito. And so that's why saying Ashrei or Tehillah LaDavid, Psalm 145 3 times a day, is a way to ensure the world to come. Because if you're doing Teshuvah every single day, then it makes sense that you would be zoche, meritorious enough to get Olam Haba. And so now we have an understanding of why Ashrei is the introduction to Slichot as we prepare for Yom Hadin of Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and Hashem's closeness. That first we're going to use Teshuvah to clean ourselves, to take off the stains of sin in order to be appropriately pure when Hashem is at His closest. And that's why now we understand why Ashrei is part of Pesukei Zimra. It's in fact the center of Pesukei Zimra. We're preparing for the Shema and Kabbalah Samachos Shemayim and Shemona Esrei, being close with Hashem. And also then we can understand why it is the only prayer that's necessary to say before Mincha that will prepare us for Shemona Esrei. In the Halacha, this is interesting because if one comes late to Mincha and you have an option of either saying Ashrei or davening Shemona Esrei with the Sibor, Halacha says you're supposed to first daven Ashrei of Tehillah LaDavid, and then you can do Shemona Esrei, because you have to always do Teshuvah before you come in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So, I think that we now have an understanding of the importance of the word emes, and why it's highlighted in the Karov Hashem L'chol Karav L'chol Sheikru V'emet, is that, again, saying Yid Gimel Midos, doing Teshuvah is not a simple task. It has to be done in earnest. And that's why the word emes is highlighted in the pasuk of Karov Hashem L'chol Karav L'chol Asher Yikaru V'emes. Me'er Hashem, this shir should really be a zechus for the neshama of Adina Basheva Bas Dov Ber Azriel HaLevi, and should be a zechus for Fush Lema for her son Michal ben Adina Basheva. And if anybody's interested in contributing to a fund to help the Zehavis rebuild and recover from this devastating fire that destroyed virtually everything that they owned, this is the GoFundMe that you can access.